Hello, and welcome to this lesson aimed at teaching the art of Call of Duty Search and Destroy. This lesson is for members of CIG Central Intelligence Gaming. I have formulated a paper constructed using scientific and logical reasoning, which has led me to effective, simple, and efficient techniques that can be employed for optimization purposes. In this document, we will present theoretical material asserting their validity without justification for the sake of simplicity in some cases. Before we begin, I ask the viewer to set aside all conceptions as to how to play this game mode and metaphorically open your mind to new ideas. In so doing, you will be rewarded greatly. Note, this lesson will assess search and destroy in the general sense. Specific analysis and assessment for each of the maps will be formulated in the coming days. And so with that, let us begin the lesson. Let us begin by stating the goals of the paper. So what are the goals of the paper? The goal of this paper is to formulate a comprehensive analysis and assessment detailing the most effective way to play search and destroy. We must take the complexities and nuances of the game mode and document them in the most simple and comprehensible way possible. The structure of this paper is as follows. We begin with technical specifications and observe what this suggests. We then take a look at various topics, and those topics include positional strategy, informational practices or intelligence, operating techniques, and the formulation of general strategy. Let us begin the paper by considering the technical specifications of the game mode and see what this suggests. This seems like the most reasonable place to begin. Technical specifications. In order that we are able to formulate this paper, we must first consider the technical specifications of search and destroy and see what this suggests as a method of play. This seems like the most reasonable place to begin. It may seem unnecessary to even consider this matter, but it is important for determining what is of importance in the game mode. And this in turn acts as the basis or skeletal structure from which we devise further analysis, assessment, and conclusions. So, search and destroy is a game mode in which there are two teams, the attackers and the defenders. The goal of the attackers is to either eliminate the defenders within the time limit, 1.5 minutes, or to plant the bomb and have it explode. The job of the defenders is to either eliminate the attackers or prevent or defuse a bomb plant within the time limit, 1.5 minutes and 45 seconds respectively. So, these are the technical specifications of the game mode. What is of importance for our purposes is what this suggests to us as a method of play. These technical specifications imply that any strategy, using the term strategy in the general sense, devised should be derived from the skeletal structure formed by these incontrovertible facts. However, in my view, as a consequence of experience, it is unwise to base strategy, using this term in the general sense once again, on the notion or objective of elimination. As a consequence of ruling this out, we are left with the one and only alternative. That is, the main objective of the attackers should be to plant the bomb and have it explode, and the objective of the defenders should be to prevent a bomb plant from happening, and if it does happen, dealing with that context in the most appropriate, effective, and efficient way possible, which will be a matter for consideration later. It is important to note that one must be able to dynamically react to contexts in order that we respond to unforeseen circumstances in the appropriate manner. Thus, these are generalized objectives. So let us move on to topics. In order that we are able to formulate this comprehensive assessment and analysis, we must examine some topics of interest. These topics aim to teach effective techniques that can be employed in the game mode to optimize your ability to win. At the end, we will document the practice of formulating strategy based on taking into consideration all of the topics, which will be written about in a self-contained manner. And so with that, let us begin our coverage of fundamentally important concepts. Let us begin with positional strategy. Our first topic is strategy. There are actually, for our purposes, two kinds of strategy that we will consider. The first is the general idea of formulating operator responses taking into consideration all topics that will be documented. The other, and the one of interest to us at this present time, is what I call positional strategy. Let us define how we are to interpret the term positional strategy. Definition: positional strategy relates to the practice of coordinating and directing the motion of operators and resources throughout the map. It is constrained by the map's geometric properties and resource allocation, which will be elaborated on at a later time. In other words, how the defenders choose to allocate their resources at the start of the round, which translates to a particular operator formation, how they reallocate resources, and how the attackers gain control of a site are all examples of things that can be considered to be part of the term positional strategy. Now, let us move on to document some concepts that are of fundamental importance. So, we want to cover universal concepts to begin with. When producing an analysis and assessment of the game mode concerned, it is important that we look specifically at what is of importance with respect to the defenders and the attackers. In other words, we wish to reason about how these two teams conduct their business in relative isolation, because how they do so is different as a consequence of their different objectives. We say relative isolation because, in reality, the way the attackers play affects how the defenders operate, and so on and so forth. This ideal is aimed at nothing more than documentation simplicity. However, there are some concepts that are universal. In other words, they are useful and of importance for both the attackers and the defenders. And so with that, let us begin with covering what I would call universal concepts. Let us begin with the concept of resources. We will reference the notion of a resource throughout the paper, but what does that actually mean? In other words, what is a resource? Resources are your theoretical physical presence, your weaponry, and thus your ability to exert control on a particular location on the map, your equipment and other utilities, your specialist abilities. These are all examples of things that can be considered to be resources. I shall make a note on one of these points, and that is that I shall make a note on one of these points, and that is as follows. Why is your physical presence considered a resource? This is because implicit in physical presence is the ability to conduct information collection, amongst other things. Let's move on to our next fundamental universal concept, and that is what's called operator formation. We will use the term operator formation throughout the discussion. But what does this mean? An inspection of the technical specification of the term formation leads to the following definition. Formation: a group of people or things in a particular arrangement or pattern. I believe this definition corresponds with the intended notion. To see why, let us discuss this notion. First, let us define operator formation. An operator formation is a theoretical construct that details the position of all operators on a team. Thus, a different operator formation implies operators assuming different positions. We can represent this graphically like so. So I'm going to draw a graphic now in order to articulate this concept. So suppose this is a two-dimensional representation of a particular map, and scattered throughout the map there are various different geometric constructs. Now let us place some operators onto this particular map. Let us connect them like so. So here we have a two-dimensional representation of a map with various different geometric constructs scattered throughout it. And on this two-dimensional representation, we place 4 operators. Now what we say is as follows. The operator formulation is a theoretical construct that details the positions of each operator on a particular team. And so consequently, we're taking into consideration all positions, and this forges a theoretical construct that enables us to determine the totality of positions relating to the positions that a particular team assumes. I think, in virtue of its relative simplicity, further documentation is not warranted or required. So, let us move on to discuss another universal concept, and that is what is called the implicit area of control. So, implicit area of control. Let us pose a very simple yet important question. What parts of the map do the attackers have control over at the beginning of the round, and similarly for the defenders? And why is this important? It is actually possible to scientifically validate any assertions made in relation to this matter. To see how, consider the following example. Note, first we will examine a theoretical device that, in virtue of its properties, cannot be reasonably employed in practice, but this is to aid in the construction and articulation of the primary concept of concern. So let us begin by examining the concept of the literal implicit area of control. Let us suppose the following arrangement. So, here we have a map whose geometric properties are exactly that of a square with respect to the shape of the floor, with the absence of any geometric constructs located on the map. Now, suppose we place 2 operators, like we have indicated, onto the square such that they are in contact with the separate sides, with separate but opposite sides, and such that the distances between the operators and the 2 sides they are not in contact with are equivalent. Thus we obtain the following figure. As we can see, we have a two-dimensional representation of a map. Of course, it isn't accurate in the sense that the geometric properties are exactly that of a square. It's more like a rectangle. But we will assume that it is a square, and we place 2 operators on the opposing side. One operator here, indicated on the blue circle, and one operator here. They are placed on opposing sides of the square, and the distances between them and the sides they are not in contact with are equivalent. Thus we obtain the following specifications. This distance is x, this distance is x, this distance is y, and this distance is y, whatever those values may be. Now, given this arrangement, we pose a simple question. What parts of the map does operator 1, and we'll label this is operator 1, and this is operator 2, what parts of the map does operator 1 have implicit control over, assuming two fundamental variables of concern conform to the following requirements, namely that we have uniform velocity for traversal, and as a consequence of the purpose of this explanatory device, no enemy engagement. And by that we mean that practically opposing operators do not shoot their weapons at each other. In order to formulate an answer to this question, we must also suitably define what it means to have control of a part of the map. For this particular example, it means that the operator in question is able to position themselves at that particular location on the map before the opposing player. It should be clear at this stage that it is possible to scientifically validate assertions made in relation to this matter. So, assuming the starting locations of each operator conform to the requirements of perfect symmetry, and further asserting uniform velocity, all we have to do is construct this arrangement, choose a point on the map, and construct a series of vectors joining the initial location of the operators and the point on the map we have chosen, such that no vector penetrates any material or solid substances. All vectors are contained within the confinements of the map, and the addition of the magnitudes of the vectors is as short as possible given the previous requirements. With respect to both starting locations, whichever value obtained for the mathematical operation of addition of the vectors is the smallest, then the respective operator is said to have, with respect to the concept of the literal implicit area of control, implicit control over that location. It may be helpful to imagine constructing vectors on a two-dimensional representation of the map, but this has a fatal flaw. That flaw is that we cannot actually represent the precise geometric properties of the map with respect to the shape of the floor in two dimensions. Thus, this approach can lead to inaccuracies. Consequently, we must employ this process in three dimensions. Now, how can this be theoretically implemented? Well, it can be theoretically implemented as follows. First, we make use of a theoretical Cartesian coordinate system. We then have this system coincide with the map. Now, using the shortest path available, we construct a series of three-dimensional vectors from the starting location of each operator to the point in question. Thus we obtain a Cartesian coordinate system capable of representing three-dimensional constructs with a series of linked three-dimensional vectors. Now, in order to obtain the magnitude of each vector, we employ the use of Pythagoras' theorem twice in succession in three-dimensional space. Once this is done for each vector related to a particular operator, we employ the use of the fundamental mathematical operation of addition in order that we obtain the distance for from the starting location to the point concerned. Now, whichever value is larger, then the operator not connected to this value is said to have implicit control over that point on the map, assuming the necessary preconditions set forth and definitions laid down beforehand. Now, if we do this for every point on the map, we find that we obtain a picture that resembles something like the following graphic. And I will proceed to draw this graphic. So, we look at the construct we have just formulated, and basically what it's telling us is that operator 1, which is this operator here, has implicit control, given the definitions laid down beforehand, of every point up to the halfway point with respect to the square. Again, it's a rectangle in reality, but we will assume it's a square. There are certain imperfections in this process. And with respect to operator 2, his implicit area of control with respect to the literal implicit area of control, which is a theoretical device that will be used in order to aid in the articulation of the main concept of concern, his literal implicit area of control extends from where he begins on the map up to the halfway point of the square. And this is represented in the graphic. So, as we would intuitively expect, the literal implicit area of control extends to the halfway point with respect to both operators. Careful viewers will have noticed a fatal flaw in the preceding remarks. What practical use is the concept of the literal implicit area of control if it is to be constrained by factors we cannot reasonably expect to hold in practice? Its purpose is to act as a theoretical device to ease the process of articulating the main concept relating to this matter, which is of concern to us, and that is the implicit area of control. Before we begin documenting this concept, let us state what this concept is and why it is useful or important. Firstly, the concept is aimed at scientifically validating assertions relating to what the attackers have implicit control over with respect to the map, and the same for the defenders. It is important because this is the basis upon which we assess how to allocate resources and how we devise positional strategy in general. In order that we get an idea of this concept, consider the following example. Suppose we have, once again, a square map with spawns on either side that meet the requirements of being symmetric. Now, suppose in the center of the square there is a smaller square surrounded by cover blocks. This time we assume the ability to engage, and we also make the assumption of uniform velocity. This time we assume the ability to engage, as has been indicated. Thus, the preconditions have changed. The picture in your mind should look something similar to the following graphic, which I will proceed to draw. We have a square map with operators located on either side. Of course, in reality this is a rectangle, but for theoretical purposes we will assume it to adhere to the geometric requirements of a square. Now, within the center of the larger square there's a smaller square surrounded by cover blocks. Now, we pose the very simple question: what is the implicit area of control? And by that we mean, what parts of the map do both operators implicitly control given the preconditions specified? It should be clear that the implicit area of control no longer extends to the halfway point with respect to both operators. As a consequence of the introduction of geometric constructs and the preconditions that we adhere to, which is that we allow engagement between operators, practically the implicit area of control extends to the cover blocks closest to the operators concerned. This is fairly simply due to the fact that as a consequence of the introduction of cover blocks and allowing engagement, operators who attempt to push into the middle of the smaller square will put themselves at a disadvantage with respect to the opposing operator. This is well known in FPS games. The principle is as follows: the less character model exposed with respect to the opposing operator, the greater the implicit advantage. So what we are saying here is that the implicit area of control will look something comparable to the following specification. And in reality, it will look something like this. And this middle zone is what we call a buffer zone, or a zone of ambiguity, or a neutral zone. This zone right here. But we will elaborate on this matter in the documentation that will be set forth. It should be clear at this stage that an assessment of the implicit area of control of a team is one of assessing map geometry, initial spawn locations, and assuming uniform velocity. And so this will be done for each map. However, this assessment is made more complex by perks like lightweight and specialist abilities like Ruin's grappling hook. And so consequently, and this is within the context of Black Ops 4, of course, search and destroy strategy in general pertains to all Call of Duty games, but specifically as it relates to Black Ops 4, we have to take that into consideration. And so consequently, we need to decide whether or not to account for these things in our assessment or determine them to be negligible. Now, let us once again ask why this concept is important. The implicit area of control is the basis upon which we determine resource allocation and conduct information collection, which will be covered in the next topic, entitled Informational Practices or Intelligence. Now let us draw another graphic in order to articulate a particular concept. So these are spawn locations. So, we have a map with certain geometric properties, and we wish to conduct an assessment as to the implicit area of control. Let us assert that the appropriate analysis has taken place, and it resembles something like the above map, dotted with objects of particular geometry. Now, here's the key observation. We mark the implicit area of control for both teams. However, you will notice that there is a zone with striped lines, and I will proceed to draw those striped lines now. So there is a zone with striped lines. This zone represents neutral zones that no team has implicit control over. We will refer to these as buffers. Now, these buffers are typically located where key parts of the map are located, and so to obtain control of these parts of the map, we must employ executes, which will be covered in this paper. And so, with that, let us proceed to document another fundamental concept. So, let us move on to discuss something called multi-vector attacks. Suppose for a moment that a defensive team is tasked with defending some geometric construct located somewhere on the map. Something comparable to a bomb site in Search and Destroy will do. In order to defend this location, the defensive operators are located in close proximity to one another. Now, we refer to the immediately surrounding part of the map with respect to the geometric construct as the site. Now, we pose a very simple question. What is the most effective way to obtain control of this site concerned? The answer is what is called a multi-vector attack. Now, a vector is a mathematical construct that is capable of representing two values, those values being direction and magnitude. It can be represented geometrically as a directed line segment with the direction of the line representing the direction component and the length of the line representing the magnitudinal component. However, for our purposes, we use the term vector to indicate direction. When we use the term multi-vector, we mean for multiple directions. When we translate the term multi-vector attack into the corresponding definition set forth, we obtain a nonsensical statement. But succinct terminology can be most pleasing. Furthermore, it is the concept that matters. So long as that is understood, everything is okay. Furthermore, the graphical representation of the vectors overlaid on a map need not be straight. Thus, we can draw curved lines to indicate paths taken by operators and regard them as being vectors exclusively for our purposes. Now, the reason the most effective way to attack a defensive point is a multi-vector attack is because you split defensive resources, thus rendering their ability to retain site control diminished with respect to what it may have been initially. And so we can represent this graphically as follows. So we will once again construct a two-dimensional representation of a map. And suppose located somewhere on this map is a defensive point. And suppose we have defensive operators defending this location, indicated by the purple circles. Of course, in the context of Black Ops 4, it's 5v5, but we're just trying to articulate the general concept. A multi-vector attack can be represented graphically as follows. We have the attacking operators represented like so, and we push to the defensive point from multiple directions, thus splitting defensive resources and diminishing and degrading their ability to retain site control. This is the ideal. Now, let us contrast this with the alternative approach, which is to stack on one side and push as a team. The undesirable properties of this approach can be demonstrated by considering what the behavior of the defenders is to respond to this threat. Put simply, all defensive resources, in the absence of a multi-vector approach on behalf of the attackers, can be focused in one direction. This simplifies and eases the process of retaining control of a site. This can be represented graphically as follows, and I will proceed to draw a graphical representation of this concept. So we have a two-dimensional representation of the map, and we have a defensive point with defensive operators, and we have attacking operators. And the attacking operators, in the absence of a multi-vector approach, will typically stack a particular location on the map and push as a team. This is not the ideal approach. Now, this concept is particularly important when we consider attacking positional strategy and defensive positional strategy, including site retakes. We will discuss this at a later time. So let us proceed to draw a final graphic relating to the matter of multi-vector attacks, and then we will proceed to cover other topics of concern. So suppose once again we have a two-dimensional representation of a map, with geometric constructs scattered throughout. And suppose we have a defensive point, indicated by this geometric construct, and we have defensive operators defending this particular defensive point. The ideal is to have a conduct a multi-vector attack on this defensive point, as indicated in the graphic. This splits defensive resources and degrades their ability to retain site control. So, here we have a map of a particular geometry. The black dots, or the purple dots, represent the defenders, and the blue dots, or the red dots. So let me just be clear about this. The purple dots represent the defenders, and the red dots represent the attackers. Now, we draw arrows relating to the paths taken by the attacking operators. This is graphically represented by means of the employment of arrows, these particular arrows here. Now, this graphically represents the notion of a multi-vector attack. Note that a multi-vector attack is only practically permissible if the map's geometry permits it. Furthermore, note that attacking positional strategy should be formulated given the construction of a skeletal structure, which we will elaborate on next. In other words, we should neglect an approach that adheres to the general statement, go A. This is not the most effective approach. So let us move on to consider attacking positional strategy. Let us proceed to reason about positional strategy from the perspective of the attackers. So in other words, we have finished our coverage of universal concept, and we wish to talk about positional strategy with respect to the attackers and the defenders. We will begin with the attackers, as this informs us how to devise defensive positional strategy. So let us move on to attacking positional strategy. We have previously stated that, in general, the most effective way to obtain control of a defensive point is to conduct a multi-vector attack. This will be important in the formulation of attacking positional strategy. We have previously remarked on the conclusions reached given an assessment of the technical specifications of search and destroy. Those remarks indicated that we should take an approach centered around the notion of objectives. From an attacking perspective, what this means is that our positional strategy should be ultimately aimed at obtaining control of a bomb site, planting the bomb, and forming a defensive perimeter around the bomb site in order to prevent the bomb from being defused. We will discuss this in detail at a later stage. Now, the most obvious question that arises given the most previous of considerations is, in order to plant at a site, what do the attackers need control of in order to effectively and safely do that? The answer to this is arrived at by considering the geometric properties of the map, which we will discuss at a later stage. Now, once we obtain the answer to this question, these parts of the map can be considered as constants that form a skeletal structure around which we devise further positional strategy. Now, to be succinct, what qualifies a region of the map for constant status is whether or not the hypothetical presence of a defensive operator would mean that the attackers are susceptible to defensive actions taken by the defenders. Now, considering the ideas set forth in the previous remarks, what we are saying is that the ideal method of planting a bomb is to obtain control of the parts of the map we consider to be constants with respect to a particular bomb site. That is the skeletal structure around which we devise positional strategy. In other words, What never changes is what you need control of to plant at a site. That is the constant skeletal structure that we speak of. What changes is the means by which we obtain control of these constants. That is the dynamic element that constitutes the positional strategy we devise around the skeletal structure we speak of. As has been indicated, the most ideal way to achieve the aim of site control is a multi-vector attack, but this is only viable if map geometry permits it. Also, the ideal is a multi-vector attack that projects power in behind the sites. We state this with no justification for the sake of simplicity. And so an assessment for each map must be produced in order to determine the skeletal structure relating to each map, and each bomb site in particular. We have talked about the skeletal structure constructed from constants relating to the geometric properties of the map, and formulating positional strategy around that. But how do we do that? We implement what is called an execute. In short, an execute relates to the coordination of resources with the goal of obtaining control of a particular point on the map. This is the dynamic element relating to the skeletal structure. In other words, it is the job of teams to construct effective, ingenious, and efficient executes that culminate in the assumption of control of key map locations. Typically, executes happen in stages. So for instance, you peek this while he pushes this, after which he throws a stun, and another pushes this, and so on. The goal of any paper should be to articulate the concepts concerned in the most simple way possible. Thus, we have taken attacking positional strategy and distilled it into a relatively simplified form. To summarize, from an attacking perspective, we say that we have the objective of obtaining site control in order to plant the bomb. We conduct an assessment as to what parts of the map are of importance for obtaining that, from which we derive a set of constants that join together to construct a skeletal structure. Then, we devise positional strategy, in particular executes, to obtain control of these constants, plant the bomb, and form a defensive perimeter to prevent a bomb defuse. In practice, positional strategy is actually informed by intelligence collection, but we wish to consider the topic of positional strategy in isolation. Furthermore, teams must be able to dynamically react to unforeseen circumstances in the most effective manner. This is best done by gaining experience of thousands of contexts through practice. Thus, we have simplified attacking positional strategy greatly, which is most certainly the ideal. And so I will draw a graphic here which will represent this simplified form of attacking positional strategy. So, we have a skeletal structure constructed from various what we call map constants. And this is the skeletal structure. Now, what we do is, given the skeletal structure, we devise positional strategy. So we have a skeletal structure around which we devise positional strategy and in particular executes. Now, positional strategy can be a relatively complex topic because when we say we want to devise positional strategy around the skeletal structure, what we mean is that we want to devise a method by which we direct resources around the map. And so there are two different aspects to positional strategy. There is the assessment part, which relates to assessing map geometric properties and deriving a set of constants, and that is to be considered in the domain of positional strategy. But when we talk about devising further positional strategy, we simply mean that we're devising methods by which we direct resources around the map. Now, Given this graphic, this, this graphical representation of the concept, this is to lead to a bomb plant, and then we form a defensive perimeter. Now one note on defensive perimeter before I move on. The precise means by which you defend a bomb site doesn't have to adhere to the traditional view of what a defensive perimeter represents. In other words, a defensive perimeter is traditionally viewed as the deployment of resources in a way that is consistent with the geometric properties of a circle. In other words, we identify the point of interest that we want to defend, and then we deploy resources in all directions in order to effectively defend that position, that defensive point. But in reality, we can, for our purposes, consider defensive perimeter to also mean stacking a particular location on the map. And there are a whole deal of different ways we can deal with particular contexts in order to effectively defend a site. And so that comes with experience. Finally, we should note that an understanding of the implicit area of control for the attackers will be desirable, as this is the basis upon which executes are conducted. So let us draw a final graphic to get across these concepts concerned, this notion. So suppose we have a map, a two-dimensional representation of a map with various different geometric constructs scattered throughout, which we will construct now. These are two-dimensional representations of doorways. So this is a building, and these are doorways. Now, suppose that, so here's what we have. We have a graphical representation, a two-dimensional graphical representation of a map with various different geometric constructs scattered throughout. And we have two bomb sites, and we have defensive resources and defensive operators deployed in positions in order to defend particular bomb sites. Now, given our previous considerations, what we want to do is conduct an assessment as to the skeletal structure relating to the B bomb site. In other words, what are the most important parts of the map? What are the important parts of the map we need control of in order to effectively and safely plant at a particular site? We conduct that assessment, and that assessment is best done off the basis of extensive experience. In other words, it's a skill that you learn through extensive experience with respect to the analysis of map geometric properties. And so when we conduct this analysis and assessment, we obtain something like the following graphic. Namely, that the most important parts of the map we need control of are these locations here. So this is the first stage of attacking positional strategy. We conduct an assessment as to what constitutes the skeletal structure around which we devise executes. And that is an assessment of map geometric properties. And so once we derive a set of constants, they form together, they join together to construct a skeletal structure around which we devise positional strategy. And for the sake of this particular example, we make the assertion that the locations highlighted in blue are the key locations to plant at a particular site. And so once we have determined that, then we devise what are called executes, which is essentially the directing of resources with respect to their motions throughout the map. And so one viable means of obtaining control, and we will represent the attackers as red circles this time, one reasonable method of obtaining control of this particular site is to devise and execute that adheres to the view that we must obtain control of all key locations on the map in conjunction with the notion of a multi-vector attack. And so consequently, these particular attacking operators can push, and their motion can correspond with this particular arrow in order to obtain the control of this particular location, and then we can conduct a multi-vector attack on this particular location here. Now in this particular example, if all goes well with respect to the motions of these operators, then there will be one defensive operator left, and so a defensive operator will essentially have to fight a war on two fronts, and that is impractical, and so consequently the attackers will have great success in obtaining control of this particular location on the map. So once again, the blue construct represents the key locations on the map we need control of in order to plant at a particular site. Of course, we talk about fighting a war on two fronts. That's a well-known expression. It basically just means that your resources have been split and you're having to defend on multiple fronts. So let us move on to discuss defensive positional strategy. Let us begin to formulate a framework that details how the defender should operate within the context of the game mode. To do this, we shall set forth a philosophy, the justification of which will follow. Note, it should be ideal to scientifically validate your ideas as to how to function, and the term philosophy seems to imply that this scientific basis is lacking. But this is for want of a better word. However, ultimately the practice of competitive video games is very much so an art, metaphorically studied with gems of scientific analysis. With that being said, let us set forth this philosophy we speak of. Inevitably, we must, for once, invoke concepts that will be covered in different sections. So the concepts are as follows. We want to allocate resources, collect information, reallocate resources to deal with threats that arise using a rotation protocol. If you lose site control, conduct a site retake, ideally employing the notion of a multi-vector attack, as this has been shown to be most effective. Note, this is only possible as when the bomb is planted, then practically the attackers become the defenders and the defenders become the attackers. We will refer to this as flipping the dynamic. Let us elaborate on and justify these assertions. Note, this only considers points relating to positional strategy. Intelligence collection obviously informs us how we should behave, but we are trying to formulate a coherent assessment. Let us deal with the points outlined previously in a sequential fashion. We will begin with resource allocation. So let us analyze resource allocation. Resource allocation. As has been previously stated, the job of the defenders should be to prevent a bomb plant from occurring, and if that does happen, conduct an effective site retake in a timely fashion in order to eliminate the attackers and defuse the bomb. This is the fundamental basis upon which we operate. Now, the defenders have a finite set of resources that can be deployed, and so the question is, how do we decide on how to allocate resources? The first fundamental principle that we should abide by is the idea that we want no gaps in our defense. The reason for this principle is that you can operate with confidence in the zone behind the line formed by theoretically connecting the operator formation, as shown in the following graphic, which I will draw shortly. This is important for resource allocation, which we will come to shortly. Furthermore, adhering to this principle ensures that opposing operators cannot project resources behind the defensive operators. This is most surely a desirable property. Let us construct a graphical representation of the concept I'm trying to articulate here. Once again, we have a two-dimensional representation of a map. with geometric constructs scattered throughout. Now, here's what we mean by no gaps in our defense. We want to employ an operator formation and they collect information relating to the lines of sight corresponding to these arrows. We want to employ an operator formation that gives us a comprehensive intelligence collection capability, such that we can form behind the theoretical construct of the operator formation a zone within the confinements of which we can operate with a degree of freedom and safety. In other words, there are going to be no nasty surprises as to attacking positional strategy, in the sense that you won't get attacked from behind, and that is obviously the ideal. And so this is the first principle that we state, and it is the principle by which we must abide. The principle is as follows. We must adhere to the notion that we want no gaps in our defenses. And so what would that look like? What would having no gaps in our defense look like? Well, we can represent this as follows. We can manipulate this graphic in the following manner. Suppose there are two defensive operators. We take out the middle one in order to illustrate this concept. And suppose we have attacking operators initially situated at this location. Now, as a consequence of the operator formation being employed, we can see that there's a clear gap in our defense, and that gap is here. And so what can happen is that the attackers can project resources into this location on the map, and then conduct a multi-vector attack on these defensive operators. Like so. And this is obviously not something we want to allow to happen, and so consequently we want to actively avoid it. So, we have derived our first principle. However, we have yet to formulate a method for the deployment of resources, or in other words, the position of defensive operators. And so one may legitimately interject at this point and question, how do we decide precisely how to allocate resources throughout the map? To obtain the answer to this question, consider the following reasoning. In order to effectively defend, you must understand how to effectively attack. We have learned that to attack effectively, we must conduct an assessment pertaining to the map's geometric properties to derive a set of constants that can be joined together to construct the basis upon which executes are devised. It logically follows that if the defenders are able to prohibit access to these constants, they will prevent a bomb plant from occurring. Consequently, the defenders conduct an assessment regarding the key locations on the map with respect to each bomb site and derive a set of constants that join together to construct a skeletal structure governing further positional strategy. Careful viewers will observe that we are to neglect the notion of attempting to defend the bomb site itself. This is the naive approach. The appropriate way to operate is to allocate resources to obtain control of map constants, whatever those constants may be. Next, we observe any overlap between these constants and the implicit area of control with respect to the defenders. Now, here is a question of fundamental importance. How do we decide to allocate a finite set of resources in order to obtain control of all key locations on the map? The answer is, practically, this is not feasible. Consequently, we must prioritize the allocation of resources. To do this, we take into consideration the following factors: bomb location with respect to the defender's implicit area of control, map geometry, and the intelligence picture. And we will cover intelligence collection in the next topic. Analyzing each factor, we obtain the following results. If the defenders have implicit control of a bomb site, they can allocate resources there much faster than the attackers, and can arrange these resources in a desired manner due to, due to the luxury of time. The second factor, if the map geometry of a particular site can be considered complex, then you may have to allocate more resources to that site to deal with the complexities. Furthermore, if the geometry is such that you can obtain information on attempts to push a site at an early stage, then we can use the technique whereby we allocate more resources to the alternative site and rotate those resources if necessary. Consult the following figure to get an idea of this concept. Let me construct a graphical representation of the concept concerned. So here we have a graphical representation of the map with the B bomb site and the A bomb site. Now suppose that roughly speaking the attacking operators are initially located at this location. Then what we can do with respect to articulating or representing the notion that has just been indicated in the most previous of considerations, what we can do is we can deploy most of our resources to the A site and deploy one resource to this location to conduct intelligence collection pertaining to attacking operations relating to motion on this particular side of the map. As a consequence of the geometric properties of this side of the map, namely that it is a long line of sight, we can afford to allocate more resources to the A site, and as a consequence of the distance, the relative distance of this particular side of the map, rotate these resources through their base to deal with threats that arise given attacking operations pertaining to motion on this side of the map. This is what I will call an early warning detection system. In other words, we deploy an operator to this location to collect intelligence on the side of the map. If they observe attacking operators attempting to push this side of the map, then, as has been indicated, we have the luxury of time to rotate our resources through our base in order to adequately deal with that threat. Finally, although this will be covered in the next topic, we must take into consideration what our intelligence suggests and formulate effective responses to counter threats. Now, what can change is how we allocate resources, but what does not change is the skeletal structure. Consequently, resource allocation is constrained or enhanced depending on your view. Constrained implies some sort of undesirable limitation by these map constants. Note that what we are saying here is that the operator formation can and should change, so long as it respects the map constants. It should change because we simply cannot repeat unsuccessful operator formations as a consequence of the opposing team effectively conducting intelligence collection and adapting. Thus, the operator formation can change. Ideally, we should equip ourselves with a metaphorical box of operator formations that can be employed to counter threats effectively. Also, as usual, we can employ unconventional positional strategy if this is the appropriate response to unforeseen circumstances. Furthermore, the deployment of resources should be done taking into consideration where those resources are most effective, or alternatively, we assess the map constants and choose resources based on that assessment and deploy them to certain positions. To keep it simple, assault rifles for long range and submachine guns for close range. But we must also take into consideration what the resources will be tasked to do when the rotation protocol is enacted, and so on. We will cover this in more detail shortly. Now, let us consider what we do next. My view is that the defender should play around the objective. Consequently, as has been stated before, we, from a defensive perspective, aim to prevent a bomb plant from happening. An effective method of doing this will be articulated at a later time. So, what the defenders do is collect information and as a consequence reallocate resources to deal with threats that arise on the map. That resource reallocation takes place according to a rotation protocol and adheres to the view that we should rotate resources through the base or safety zone, as we have accounted for this as a consequence of our comprehensive operator formation and consequently intelligence collection capability. Now, what we mean by rotation protocol is that there is a predefined method for the reallocation of resources which takes into account we want no gaps in our defense. For example, suppose that we are deploying and we have already indicated that this is the naive approach to take, it's not the correct approach to take, but nevertheless we will proceed to document it in the following manner. Suppose that we deploy 2 operators to A, 1 to mid, and 2 to B. Suppose the B operators have collected information indicating that the attackers are attempting to push B. In order to deal with that threat, we should enact a rotation protocol that says the player watching mid goes B and one person from A picks up mid, as the terminology goes. This rotation regime aims to be efficient. That is the reason the player from A doesn't go to B. This takes a longer time than it does to implement the protocol described previously. And so let us discuss, or let us actually discuss, or let us construct a graphical representation of this concept. So again, we have a 2-dimensional representation of the map. And so on this map are located various different geometric constructs, and we have the A site and the B site. Now suppose attacking operators are initially located here. And again, it's 5v5 within the context of Black Ops 4 competitive. But of course, these concepts are applicable to most Call of Duty, if not all Call of Duty. In fact, they are applicable to all Call of Duty games. And so what we say is the following. The defensive resources are deployed in the following manner. We deploy 3 to B and 1 to this location here. And the operator in this location watches this line of sight to collect intelligence relating to the motions of the attacking operators. Now, here's the proposition. Suppose that these defensive operators here deploy to this location and begin collecting intelligence, as is evidenced by the observing of this particular line of sight. We'll call that stage 1. Now suppose that the attacking operators, with respect to their motions, corresponds to this particular vector here. Again, we have a custom definition for how we're to interpret the term vector. And so suppose that the motion of the attackers corresponds with this particular vector or arrow. Now we consider this to be stage 2. Now as a consequence of this motion, this defensive operator here collects intelligence relating to the motions of the attacking operators and derives the appropriate response given the information collected, namely the communication of that information and the formulation of the appropriate response. But we will consider the collection of this information, the specific information, as stage 2. Now, stage 3, with respect to the attackers, is to aggressively push the A site. This is stage 3. Now, the rotation protocol, and this is what it's about setting in motion a notion for how the rotation protocol should be implemented. And so the general idea is this. We have stage 1 where these defensive operators here are collecting information by observing this particular line of sight. Now, for the sake of theoretical considerations, we assume that they can't see. This is a generalized graphical representation of the map in 2 dimensions. And so consequently, technically speaking, the defensive operators can see precisely what the attacking operators are doing. But we will neglect that for the moment. We just assume the defensive operators are collecting information by observing this particular line of sight here, and so on. We suppose this operator here is collecting information by watching this particular line of sight. Now, technically, he can also watch this line of sight, but we neglect that notion for now. Now, here's the key. As soon as this particular defensive operator collects information pertaining to the fact that the attacking operators are pushing in this direction, we should enact a rotation protocol in order to adequately and effectively deal with that threat. And so what that means is that this operator here rotates directly onto the A site. This operator here rotates directly onto the A site. And this operator here rotates and picks up mid. And this operator, in the absence of any further activity, stays at A. Now, of course, if they are about to plant at A, if we assess that to be the case, or if they have planted at A, of course, that operator will then make a determination as to how to conduct the site retake, whether or not he will take part in a multi-vector attack on the site, or whether or not he will rotate back, stack this particular location, and push out as a team. So that's what the rotation protocol is. The rotation protocol basically anyways, as I was saying, the rotation protocol basically is a procedure that defines the reallocation of resources to different parts of the map. So, just to be clear, a rotation regime details how to reallocate resources on the map and should be implemented in the most effective and efficient way possible. So, to summarize, we conduct an assessment as to how to initially allocate resources. We then conduct information collection, reallocating resources to deal with threats implicit in that information collection. And if they gain site control, conduct the site retake. And specifically as it pertains to the reallocation of resources, we do that by means of a rotation protocol. So, the last thing I would like to note on defensive positional strategy is the notion of something called positionally strategic multi-layered approaches. So, we will finish our discussion of defensive positional strategy by considering a final fundamentally important technique. It is called positionally strategic multi-layered approach. Let us begin to formulate a formal definition of this terminology. Firstly, it has been noted that the defenders take an objective-oriented approach. That is to say, they operate to prevent a bomb plant in general. It logically follows that the more opportunities you have to prevent that from happening, the more likely you are to be successful. And that is the essence of the positionally strategic multi-layered approach. To be succinct, we equip ourselves with a varied set of techniques to be employed in a sequential fashion. Let us construct graphics to get an understanding of this concept. So let me construct a two-dimensional representation of the map. So here we have a two-dimensional representation of the map with various different geometric constructs, and we have the B bomb site and the A bomb site. Now here's what we want to do with this graphical representation. We want to articulate the notion of the positionally strategic multi-layered approach. And so consider the following, and also I will have to construct doorways. These are buildings here, and this is a building, and these are just geometric constructs comparable to walls. And so I will construct, these are representations of doorways, and so on. So here's the general idea. Let's go through this methodically. We have attacking operators situated in this location. Now, by the way, we will also assume that these are stairs that lead up to this platform, and then these are stairs that lead down to this platform. Of course, with respect to this side, that leads up to the platform, and we assume uniform rectilinear motion, then as a consequence of that motion, these lead down from the platform, these stairs here. Now here's the general idea. The defenders, which we will represent with blue here, deploy operators to these locations here, and those defensive operators collect intelligence. Now, this is stage one of the defensive strategy. Now, once those defensive operators, suppose that these defensive operators are deployed to locations in order to collect intelligence relating to the motions of the attacking operators, specifically as it pertains to this side of the map. Now suppose that the attacking operators push this particular location. As a consequence of that, the defensive operators will collect information, and what they will do is they will essentially abide by the notion of what's called a positionally strategic multi-layered approach. In other words, we consider defense to have multiple layers. And so the first layer is information collection. Once we have collected that information, we fall back to a different position and continue information collection. And so here's the proposition. Suppose the attacking operators push this location and the defensive operators collect information relating to that motion, then that can be considered stage one. As a consequence of the collection of that information, suppose that these defensive operators fall back to these locations here. Of course, he's not going to be situated on the geometric construct, but this is not perfect. But nevertheless, we will continue. So this falling back procedure can be considered as stage two. Now, here's what happens. If it is such that the attacking operators push this side of the map aggressively and gain site control, then what I would consider to be stage 3 is the employment of resources, in other words, grenades and things like that. And we will represent that as a squiggly line from both operators. In other words, we basically employ and deploy all the resources at our disposal in order to prevent the plant from happening. And that can also mean firing your weapon. And this can be considered as stage 3. Now, suppose that they do plant it, then, and suppose we have defensive operators deployed to these locations here. Suppose that they do plant the bomb, then stage 4 would be the site retake. And that site retake takes place as indicated by these particular arrows. These refer to the motions of these particular operators. And then these particular operators here can either choose to conduct a multi-vector retake, as indicated by this arrow, or rotate back and push out the side of the map, like so. So here's the general notion. And by the way, keep in mind in stage 2 we lose intelligence collection capability and must assume the opposing team controls this part of the map. So in other words, in stage 2 we have, let's get a bright color so we can highlight this. We have these defensive operators, perhaps not the best color, maybe green will do. Suppose we have these defensive operators here. The first stage is that they collect information. And in stage 2, they fall back to fallback positions, continue information collection, and in general, defend as best as they can this particular location of the map, utilizing this cover block to their advantage. Now, implicit in stage 2 is that we lose information collection capability on this side of the map. And so consequently, we give up control and we limit our options thereafter, and as a consequence of that, we must assume that they have obtained control of that particular location on the map. Like, ideally, if we want to be practical about this, we only fall back once we are pressured into doing so. And so consequently, we don't fall back immediately when we collect the information, only when they explicitly begin to push this particular location and this particular location. This seems like a mess. It is a mess, graphically speaking, but nevertheless, the concept is what is important. And so the idea is, in the positionally strategic multi-layered approach, is that we have many layers of defense, and we execute those layers of defense in a sequential fashion. And typically, it is collect information, fall back to a fallback location, utilize resources to prevent a bomb plant, and conduct a site retake if that does happen. And that site retake can take place by means of a multi-vector attack, or rotating your resources through your base and pushing out as a team. So that has been an analysis and an assessment in a simplified manner of defensive positional strategy. Let us move on to other topics. Okay, so before we continue, I would just like to construct a much more clear graphic because it turned into quite a mess. It's perhaps hard to observe directly what this graphic represents, and so consequently I will draw a clear representation of the graph. And that will be done now, as I'm doing. We have our bomb sites, we have geometric constructs like buildings and so on. We have our doorways leading into those buildings and between those buildings. We have our A site, we have our B site, and so on and so forth. And so here's what we say. We have a defensive operator here and a offensive operator here. And they collect information as indicated by the observing of these particular lines of sight. That is stage 1. Once we have attacking operators pushing this location here, and that can be considered stage 1. Now, once they collect that information, they fall back to these locations here, such that they assume these positions here, and they continue information collection and in general exerting control over this particular location on the map. That can be considered stage 2. Now, as has been stated, we lose intelligence collection capability implicit in that fallback procedure. Now, we suppose that, as indicated by this brown arrow, the attacking operators push to this location. Now, of course, given the geometric properties of this particular map, this would be rather difficult to do, particularly as it pertains to pushing the A site. But we suppose that they do. Then stage 3, on behalf of the defensive operators, which is indicated by these squiggly lines, is to utilize resources in order to prevent a bomb plant. Now, stage 4 is as follows. We have defensive operators here, and the defensive operators can either conduct a site retake or rotate back and push out this particular location on the map with their teammates. Oh dear. This particular location on the map. So that is stage 4. You have stage 4 indicated by these arrows, and this defensive operator can push to this location, and that can be considered as part of step 4, and this particular operator can push to this location, and you basically conduct a site retake. So the essence of the positional strategic multi-layered approach is that you have many layers of defense that are executed in a sequential fashion with the goal of preventing a bomb site plant. And so that is the general notion of a positionally strategic multi-layered approach. So, we have documented fundamental concepts related to positional strategy. We will reference this topic through the rest of this documentation. Now, let us proceed to our next topic, which is informational practices. Informational practices. I want you to imagine for a moment that in the context of a search and destroy game, you can see the opposing operators through walls, or alternatively, their positions, and how those positions change with time are marked on the minimap in some manner. Given this simple proposition, we wish to ascertain the answer to the relatively simple question, how easy would it be to beat a team if these propositions hold? The answer, in general, is very easy. Thus, this is the ideal. However, for obvious reasons, it is not practical. That is, we cannot expect these conditions to hold in practice. And so the question becomes, how close can we get to this ideal? To those not acquainted in the slightest with the propositions that will be set forth, the answer is seemingly not very close at all. However, this is not the case. We can get remarkably close as a consequence of effective intelligence, which encapsulates the notion of logical deduction or inference. Let us begin constructing a theoretical framework that will enable us to achieve this ideal. Intelligence. What is intelligence? Intelligence is an architecture that pertains to the collection of information using various techniques, the communication of that information, and the merging of that information to construct a positional model and characteristics database. We then assess and analyze this model and characteristics database and formulate formulate and implement the appropriate response in the form of positional strategy. We will discuss what the model and characteristics database are in this documentation, and we will also look specifically at how we are to reason about these theoretical constructs with respect to the attackers and the defenders. What is it useful for? Intelligence is of extreme importance because it enables us to devise effective and efficient solutions to exploit the behavior of the opposing team. The principle is simple. The more you know about the opposing team, the better a position you are in to formulate effective solutions. Let us go on to discuss the method of operation. Method of operation. Let us document this method of operation as it pertains Let us document the method of operation as it pertains to the practice of intelligence. In other words, we wish to devise a theoretical model that details how we conduct intelligence. The model is as follows. The first step. Operators are deployed to specific locations on the map given the round-specific plans when they spawn. The second step. Operators collect information using information collection techniques, which will be documented shortly. Step 3. Operators relay the information they have collected to their team by breaking down complex information and environments into short strings of information so as to make communication more efficient. Step 4. All information collected is now used in the compilation of a model and characteristic database. Repeat from step 2. Now, what we do is assess the model and characteristics database to formulate the appropriate response. Thus, these theoretical constructs inform positional strategy. In other words, we can be succinct and encapsulate these services and functions as follows. We deploy, collect, relay, construct, formulate, act, and repeat. Let's go on to discuss collection techniques. The first technique is the employment of stun grenades and other utilities. The stun grenade is one of the best intelligence collection devices that the game offers. It can be used to check for the presence of opposing players, as when an opposing player is contained within its blast radius, there will be a hit marker which will be indicative of their presence. And so use stun grenades for this purpose, namely to check parts of the map you don't necessarily want to check manually. The second collection technique, watching lines of sight. This technique is the most obvious and should be sufficiently simple such that it warrants no further documentation. However, as we will learn, we don't have to collect explicit information for this technique to be useful. The third technique is listening, which is sufficiently obvious and so consequently warrants no documentation. And streaks. The drone and RC car are superb intelligence collection devices and should be used for this purpose. Let us move on to discuss the construction of the positional model in the general sense. Construction of model. The basic idea is this. As has been indicated in the documentation of intelligence, we collect information, communicate that information, and, based off of that information, begin constructing what is called a positional model. The model is a theoretical construct capable of representing the potential locations of opposing operators. To see how we do this, consider the following graphic. I will proceed to draw a graphic and we will discuss it at length. So basically we're constructing a two-dimensional representation of a map, a top-down view, and we are constructing various geometric constructs that are located on the map. So this is a building, these are cover blocks, so on and so forth. Let us continue constructing it. So, here we have a two-dimensional representation of a map scattered throughout various different geometric constructs. For instance, this is a building with two doorways. Now, there is a spawn point 1, and this is the spawn point of the defensive operators, and there is a spawn point 2, which is the spawn point for the attacking operators. Now, let us represent the initial locations of the attacking operators by means of these circles. And let us also represent the initial locations of the defensive operators by means of these circles. Now, here's the general idea. This particular defensive operator in question, defensive operator in question can collect information by observing this line of sight. So in other words, he's employing a technique we've discussed in order to collect information. Now, this particular operator in question collects information by watching this line of sight. Now here's the key concept. As a consequence of their intelligence collection or information collection, they are able to construct, through logical inference and deduction and other techniques, a positional model relating to the potential positions of the opposing operators. And the logic is fairly simple. If we understand where the attackers initially spawn, which is here, and if we understand where the defenders initially spawn, which is here, and if we understand the time that it takes for the attackers to get across this part of the map, then we can logically deduce that if we can, in a timely fashion, collect intelligence pertaining to any motions across this part of the map by means of watching this line of sight, then what we can do is construct a positional model that relates to the potential positions of the opposing players. And so consequently, what the defending operators can do in this instance is they can build up a mental picture of where the opposing operators are located. And so consequently, what they can say is that they are not located where we draw stripes. So in other words, as a consequence of information collection and logical deduction, we have completely disregarded an entire region of the map and made it redundant. And this is ideal because it means that we can formulate effective responses in a more timely fashion. Now, we can also graphically represent other parts of the map that are accounted for, and so on. Now, as a consequence of this comprehensive intelligence collection capability, we make the assumption that the attackers are contained somewhere within this region. And so consequently, we can formulate effective responses. That might mean allocating more resources to this particular location on the map to deal with the threat. So I'll say it again to be very clear. The idea is as follows. You deploy your resources throughout the map, and you begin information collection. And all that information that has been collected is joined together to construct what's called a positional model. And the positional model is constructed as a consequence of the employment of logical reasoning. And so consequently, what we can do is we talked about how the ideal is to see operators through walls, but that's not practical. But we can get remarkably close to that ideal through effective construction of positional models. What we can do is we can pinpoint with relative precision where the opposing operators are potentially located and respond to threats before they arise. This seems like the most effective way to operate. Now, as a consequence of information collection, we are able to identify what we know, what we can infer or deduce, and what we don't know. This enables us to construct a model that essentially details the potential locations of opposing operators. As a consequence, we can formulate responses to threats more effectively and efficiently. Now, observe the following properties. Observe that if operator D, and I will mark operator D now, this is operator D, I'll do it in the same color. Observe that if operator D collects information that an opposing operator has crossed, in other words, he has observed that the opposing operators, with respect to their motions, corresponds to this particular vector, then this drastically alters the model. And so consequently, if we're not collecting, obviously it depends on the specifics of how we're collecting information. So consequently, if there was another defensive operator situated here, watching this particular line of sight, then the only region of the map that would be unaccounted for this part of the map, and so consequently the model wouldn't change that much. And so it depends on the comprehensiveness of your information collection capability. But in general, the general notion is this: if they cross, then this region of the map in general is now assumed to contain the opposing operators, in the sense that they can be positioned in those regions of the map. Also, note that it is extremely important to communicate all information, even if it is not explicit. In other words, if you observe a particular part of the map and collect no information pertaining to opposing operators, that is, in and of itself, valuable information that can aid in the construction of a more accurate positional model. Let me demonstrate this concept very clearly. Suppose that there is a wall here. And suppose we have a defensive operator located here and a defensive operator located here. We make this operator redundant, and this operator continues to collect information pertaining to this line of sight. Now, suppose that these defensive operators are collecting information corresponding to these lines of sight. As a consequence of the collection of this information, what we can say is as follows. By employing some logical reasoning, we can say that if these operators do not observe any... We'll change this slightly to articulate the concept. Suppose there is a wall there and there is a doorway here. As a consequence, in fact, we don't even need this operator here, so we can make that operator redundant. As a consequence of the operator formation that's being employed and the information collection capability that exists, what we can say is that if this operator here doesn't see anything, then that is in and of itself extremely valuable information for the construction of the positional model. Because the logical inference is that if this operator here doesn't see anything, then this entire region of the map can be considered to be free with respect to opposing operators. And so, as a consequence of this, we make the positional model much more accurate. And so long as this operator doesn't observe anybody cross, then the operators in question are contained within this region of the map. And so consequently, we have made the positional model more accurate, which is the ideal, which enables us to assess what they are planning to do and respond to threats more efficiently and more effectively. And that's the basic principle. So, this model acts as the basis upon which we formulate positional strategy. In other words, the ideal is the deployment of all resources at our disposal to increase intelligence collection capability in order to aid in the construction of the positional model. Let us move on to discuss what the characteristics database is and analyze its importance from the perspective of the defenders and the attackers. The characteristics database is a collection of all information there is to know about the opposing team. It is a fundamental pillar that guides the formulation of positional strategy and response in general. Let us reason about the concept from the perspective of the attackers before we move on to the defenders. Attacking characteristics database. From the perspective of the attackers, we wish to obtain the following information about the defenders: the operator formation they employ. We want to determine, if possible, that is to say, that the opposing team may neglect the notion of strategy or employ deception as a defense against effective intelligence, a fact that can be gained through effective information collection. How do they allocate resources? This can be most useful when we begin devising positional strategy, especially when we obtain information suggesting that the deployment of resources on behalf of the defenders is not effective or efficient. In general, if they deploy an assault rifle player to a small contained region of the map, and we learn this through the function of intelligence, then we can formulate effective responses to this information. For instance, rush with a submachine gun. This is a very simplistic overview, but nevertheless an important one. Now, observe the following graphic to get an idea of a technique that can be employed to obtain facts about opposing operator formations. So suppose we have a two-dimensional representation of a map. So we have a two-dimensional representation of a map, and we have various geometric constructs scattered throughout. And we have a doorway here and a doorway here. And suppose we have spawn point 2, which is the defenders, and spawn point 1, which is the attackers. Then the idea is this. Here is a technique. So we talk about the basic principle of the construction of the positional model. But then we want to talk about techniques that can be employed in order to aid in the construction of a more accurate positional model. And a general technique that can be used with respect to the attackers is the meticulous and methodical deployment of resources to methodically collect information pertaining to the enemy operator formation such that we can assess how to effectively combat the techniques they employ. And so the general idea is this. You basically want to collect as much information as possible, and practically what this means is that if you pick a certain region of the map and see an opposing operator, then if you can, for instance, observe the name tag associated with that character model, then you can essentially deduce a fraction of their operator formation. Now, of course, this is most effective in a game like CSGO, but in virtue of the implementation of Call of Duty with respect to its movement system in conjunction with map geometric properties that are typical in Call of Duty, operator formations tend to change quite sporadically, and so consequently this may not be possible. However, if it is possible, which it may not be possible, but it most certainly will be, you basically deploy your resources methodically in order to begin methodical construction of the positional model. And so, for instance, if an operator dies at a particular location, you observe where you died from, and from that you deduce a fraction or a fragment of their operator formation. And you do this meticulously throughout the rounds, and you start to build up a picture of their operator formation. And as a consequence of building up that picture of their operator formation, or the positional model, then we can effectively combat them because we understand their operator formation. We understand what operator formation they employ, and so consequently we can identify weaknesses in that formation and exploit them to our advantage. Now, keep in mind, this may change sporadically, which is in and of itself useful information. From the perspective of the defenders, and in general, we can obtain information detailing how the opposing team deals with particular contexts, and so on and so forth. In fact, any reasonable question, and this is an extremely important point, if we talk about the characteristics database, and the general notion of the characteristics database is that it is an information base that details everything there is to know about the opposing operators. In other words, their operator formation, what resources they make use of, where those resources are deployed, how they deal with particular contexts, how they deal with aggression, how they deal with non-aggression. Any question that you can conceive of in relation to this matter is of use, but we don't explicitly document this for the sake of simplicity. So, any reasonable question we can ask in relation to the opposing team is useful in the construction of the characteristics database. We don't document them for the sake of simplicity, as there are quite a few questions we could invoke. Now, this database is a fundamental pillar that we use to assess responses and positional strategy. So now we have talked about the construction of the positional model and the characteristics database, and let me be clear, the importance of these constructs is very high, because in so doing, you will gain an operational advantage over the opposing team. You will be able to outclass them at every level, and that is key. That is a very important point. So let us move on to discuss Call of Duty Economic Intelligence. Call of Duty Economic Intelligence pertains to the tracking of score on the opposing team. One key observation I have made whilst preparing this documentation is that the collection and processing of all information available to the player is key to increasing the efficacy of the team in general. So the question is, how do we do this? One of the key observations I made was that it was simply impractical for a single player to do this, as there is simply too much information to keep track of. And so with that came the advent of the buddy system. The buddy system simply says that you allocate one player from the opposing team to each member of the team for tracking purposes. Each member of the opposing team for tracking purposes. So let us suppose that we assign player B from one team to player A on the other team. Every time player B gets a kill, which we can track by means of the kill feed, we count from 1 upwards. If they die, we reset their score to 0. Now, in doing this, we can easily calculate, given standard practice, we can easily calculate if they have streaks, and so consequently can respond to this in the most appropriate way possible. However, there still remains a problem, and that is, how do we keep track of players' score with respect to points accumulated from objectives? The answer is simple. Unless there is direct intelligence of the specific player in question who plants the bomb, you assume that the player you are assigned to got the points and increased their score by 1. This is only possible because bomb plants are worth 100 points, which is the same for kills. Thus, we can track the streaks earned by the opposing team. And as a consequence, we can formulate the appropriate response and in particular effective positional strategy. And so the general notion is this: if they have obtained in Black Ops 4 a lightning strike, then the most intuitive response to this is to not expose yourself to that streak by employing an operator formation whereby you're putting operators into locations that are out in the open. Because this is clearly not the ideal when you're trying to combat a streak like the lightning streak or Hellstorm, and that's in Black Ops 4 in particular. Now, there is one final point I would like to note with respect to informational practices, and that is what I call the art of deception. I will be succinct so as to make the articulation of this concept more simple, or easier. So, the art of deception. Deception pertains to the act of intentionally manipulating the positional models and characteristic databases constructed by the other team. Thus, this is, in general, only viable when the opposing team are conducting the act of intelligence. Consider the following example. I will proceed to draw a graphic. We have a two-dimensional representation of a map, like so, and we have certain geometric constructs located on this map. And let us suppose we have doorways. This is a building, two-dimensional representation of a building with doorways, and this is the B site, and this is the A site. Now suppose that the defensive operators spawn at spawn point 1, indicated by S1, and suppose that the attacking operators spawn in this location. Now, let us add one final geometric construct, and we will observe why this is the case shortly. So let us represent the defensive operators on the map as purple circles. Now in practice they won't be situated in such close proximity, but this is immaterial for our present purposes. And suppose they're collecting information pertaining to any activity the attackers, or any activity that the attackers may exhibit with respect to motion past this particular line of sight. Now, as a consequence of that intelligence collection, what the attackers can do, and we will indicate this by first representing their initial location as blue circles, is they can push in the location indicated by this particular vector, again using our custom definition of what a vector is to represent, and then what we can do is, as the terminology goes, wrap back. So we are essentially, of course, in reality, their positional model will take into consideration the geometric properties of the map, and thus they can make no definitive conclusions relating to the positions of the attacking operators, and so consequently the technique may not be effective in certain contexts, but as it pertains to most teams that you will play, it is my assessment that they will fall for this trick. And the trick is to basically employ the art of deception by manipulating the information that they collect in such a manner so as to give them what is inevitably a false picture of what's going on the map, and then to exploit that false understanding to the best of your ability. So let us move on to the next topic, and the next topic is what I call operating techniques. Let us proceed to document what are called operating techniques. What are operating techniques? Operating techniques relate to the manipulation of the position of an operator and the manipulation of the theoretical camera representing the view of the map with respect to a particular operator. In order that we justify this definition, let us present a few operating techniques that can be employed for optimization purposes. First, the motion of operators around the map. In general, the motion of an operator throughout the map should minimize their susceptibility or vulnerability to threats that can arise as a consequence of defensive operators enacting any kind of plan with respect to motion. To get an idea of this concept, consider the following graphic. I will proceed to draw a graphic. We have a two-dimensional representation of a map. And on this two-dimensional representation, we have scattered throughout certain geometric constructs. Now let us suppose that this is point B. We start off at point B and we wish to get to point A, and there is the hypothetical presence of a defensive operator watching this particular location. What is the best way to get from point B to point A? Well, it should be clear, and it's quite intuitive, that the best way to do this is to utilize these cover blocks represented as the geometric constructs, and so consequently the motion of the operator should look something like this. Suppose the operator begins here. They will use the cover blocks to their advantage in order to move throughout the map, and this is a skill that is obtained by extensive experience, so you have to practice. Once you practice, it becomes second nature or intuitive and automatic as to how you should operate with respect to motion around the map. So that's a fairly simplistic concept, and so consequently we will move on. Now, also, note that motion should complement the strengths of the weaponry you use. In other words, if you're an assault rifle player, your motion shouldn't be aggressive with respect to objectives, because you're going to get into close range engagements and you will have an implicit disadvantage with respect to opposing operators with, for instance, submachine guns and so on. Okay, so the next point with respect to operating techniques is crosshair placement. You should always place your crosshair where you assess threats can emerge. This is simply because you will be able to respond to those threats more effectively and more efficiently. The next point, movement. The employment of advanced movement mechanics to gain an advantage over opponents is desirable. I learnt, as a consequence of extensive experience in advanced warfare, that rapid motion of operators leads to a harder target to hit. Thus, those, when appropriate, which is something that is learned through experience, when appropriate, which is something that is learned through experience, jump shot around corners, and so on. Also, as it relates to Black Ops 4, when using the SOG, try to strafe with it in engagements. In other words, we want to strafe with the SOG in engagements, and in general with submachine guns, because you become a much harder target to hit. And anybody who has experienced this behavior will know this, as I have personally experienced it. Also, this is something that you can learn through experience. In some contexts, it is effective to, when you observe an opposing operator at close range, instead of trying to engage immediately, move sideways whilst hip firing and then aim in. This is very effective in certain contexts. Again, that's something you'll learn through extensive experience. For instance, specifically as it pertains to Black Ops 2, and my total playtime on Call of Duty would be significantly higher than this, but specifically as it pertains to Black Ops 2, my playtime was over 60 days, perhaps over 70 days. And so consequently, I've learned a great deal as to how to operate within the context of the game mode. So let us move on to the next point, which is power positions. If I pose the question, what is the most effective way to win gunfights, you may at first feel overcome or be overcome by a sense of confidence. You jump shot, you say, and so on. This is the wrong answer. The answer is you cut the gunfight out of the picture. In other words, it is ideal to allow an opposing operator to run past you and engage them in that context than to confront them directly. Now, as it relates to power positions, which must be appropriately defined, we can position ourselves in these locations in order to have an implicit advantage over potential challengers. How does this relate to our remarks about cutting the gunfight out of the picture? It is related in the sense that these are both techniques that can be employed in order to gain implicit advantages over opposing operators. Consult the following graphic to make the abstract concrete. I'll proceed to draw a graphic in order to articulate this concept. Suppose this is a two-dimensional representation of a scene within the context of the game mode, and this time it is a side view of what's going on the map, and so consequently this is a cover block. And suppose we have an operator situated at this location here, and we have an operator situated at this location here. and perhaps we can say that there's a bomb site here. This particular location is the power position, and this operator has an implicit advantage over this operator as a consequence of this cover block, which covers a significant portion of his character model. This is typically referred to as head glitching on Call of Duty. It is a well-known technique, and this is what we would typically call a power position, and that's an example of what a power position is. Now let us move on to the last concept with respect to operational techniques, and we will also document why it is such that there are no more operational techniques documented. So the next operating technique is what's called, or what's generally called, a jiggle peak. The final technique that will be documented is what is commonly referred to as a jiggle peak. This is essentially the manipulation of the camera representing the view of an operator such that you conduct a rapid strafing motion from left to right. This is an effective means of collecting information without exposing yourself to danger. We will not document any more techniques which exist for the sake of documentation simplicity. Furthermore, these principles are best acquired through extensive experience, so practice to obtain it. Let us move on to discuss the formulation of general strategy. The formulation of general strategy pertains to the act of devising positional strategy and actions in general, taking into consideration all variables and factors documented throughout the paper, with the aim of achieving some objective, for example, site control. The idea is to initially devise positional strategy off the basis of a strategic analysis of the map. Then, we conduct effective intelligence and as a consequence mutate our positional strategy to respond to opposing actions in the most effective manner possible. Let us look at a practical example to articulate this concept. Note, the employment of imagination will be most useful to solidify an understanding of the following remarks. We start off by attacking. And so basically we start off attacking, and what we do is we begin by conducting a multi-vector attack on the site, on a particular site on the map. In doing this, we discover a fragment of their operator formation. We also begin construction of the characteristics database. So that's the first point. The first point is that the first stage of this process is that we start off by conducting a multi-vector attack on a particular site, and in doing this we discover a fragment of their operator formation, and we also begin the construction of the characteristics database. The next stage is as follows. On the next attacking round, we make the decision to not explicitly push a site and instead employ an operator formation that gives us a comprehensive intelligence collection capability in order to begin construction of a positional model and enhance the characteristics database. Now, the next stage is as follows. Suppose we show some aggression towards the alternative site with respect to the initial bomb site we pushed, and we collect information pertaining to their rotation protocol. Then we update the characteristics database as a consequence. The next stage is as follows, and this is the crucial point. On the next attacking round, as a consequence of the information contained in the characteristics database, we employ deception to trick the opposing operators into enacting their rotation protocol such that all resources are located at the bomb site we initially considered, and then devise positional strategy to obtain control of that site and plant it. Let me rephrase my previous remarks. I believe I made a mistake. So basically, I'd like to fix the following problem. I said something along the lines of all resources are located at the same bomb site, but this is obviously nonsensical. What I meant to say was that basically we want to employ the act of deception to trick the opposing operators into enacting the rotation protocol such that less resources are located at the bomb site we initially considered. That is the correct statement. And so let us move on. And then we devise positional strategy to obtain control of that site and plant. This task is made easier as a consequence of the rotation of resources on behalf of the defenders. Thus, we have devised general strategy taking into consideration the totality of variables and factors we have documented and considered. So, one of the last points I will make in this paper is as follows. We should begin thinking about search and destroy as being a game of chess. In other words, we wish to think multiple steps ahead in order to increase the efficacy of general strategy. We wish to predict the very motions of opposing resources. Consider the following example. Suppose through effective intelligence we learn the rotation protocol of the opposing team, the defenders, and then we also obtain information pertaining to the context it is enacted. Suppose this protocol is a rotation of resources through their base to deal with the ostensible threat posed by the attackers. What we can do is exploit this information as follows. Let me draw a graphic to really articulate this concept. So once again, we have a two-dimensional representation of a map. And this is bomb site A. And suppose we have defensive operators located in this location. Of course, in practice they will be spread out. But we have defensive operators located in this location, watching at this location here, watching this particular line of sight. And we have defensive operators here, watching this particular location. Now, suppose that we have attacking operators initially located at the following positions. Here's the general idea. This stage can be considered stage 1. Now, suppose that the attacking operators, these 4 attacking operators, the general idea is this. We have discovered through effective intelligence collection the rotation protocol that they employ, and furthermore we know the exact context that it is enacted in. And so consequently, we exploit this knowledge to our advantage, and so consequently what we do is we're thinking multiple steps ahead. In other words, before any motion has taken place on behalf of the defenders, we know precisely how they're going to react to actions we take. And so the general idea is this. The attacking operators push to this location here, and as a consequence, the defensive operators located here collect information pertaining to their general location. And so consequently, they articulate that information to their teammates, and this can be considered stage 2. And so consequently, as we expected and anticipated, these operators rotate through their base, and the totality of the positions of the defensive operators can be considered as a stack in order to effectively defend this particular site here. Now, as a consequence of that motion, what we can do is send an attacking operator on a flank to pinch them or contain them in this particular location here. So in other words, we're thinking multiple steps ahead. We know exactly how they behave in certain contexts. We create those contexts artificially in order to induce actions, and then we preemptively take actions based on how we anticipate they're going to behave. Based on the way we anticipate them to behave. So, what we are doing is anticipating the very motions of the opposing team before they even happen, and devising strategy to exploit this knowledge. That is why it is crucial to begin thinking about search and destroy as like a game of chess, anticipating the very motion of resources throughout the map. This can be most effective. Now, there is a final point I would like to make before I move on to my conclusion, and it is as follows. Practice is everything, and it is hard to overstate this concept. And a concrete example of how important practice is as follows. I played Black Ops 2 extensively for a long period of time. One second. So as I was saying, before I had to save my laptop from running out of battery, I was saying I would like to make a final point before I move on to my conclusion. And the point is this: practice is extremely important because you genuinely learn so much from it. And so it can be helpful to actually base these claims off of a substantive basis of evidence. In other words, we make the assertion that practice is important, and it is, and it's hard to overstate that, but we need some basis upon which that claim is made. And luckily, I have one, and it is as follows. I played Black Ops 2 for 60 to 70 days plus, and my assault rifle accuracy with the M81 went from below 20% to over 25% as far as I can remember. That is a huge increase. And it is a testament to the importance of practice. Now, let me move on to my conclusion. So, my conclusion. To conclude, we have documented various concepts of importance in this lesson. We have done this in the most simple manner possible, which is the ideal. We then talked about the construction of general strategy, taking into consideration all variables and factors we have covered. This has led to effective, efficient, and simple techniques that can be employed for optimization purposes. I believe the employment of these ideas will greatly improve your S&D game. Search and destroy game, that is. And so with that, I thank you for watching. Leave a comment if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next time. I will see you next time. Whenever that is. Which will be perhaps whenever I construct analysis of the specific maps. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.